our Q&A. We already have a bunch of questions. This is from Paul Flansburgh. Jesus' disciples were crestfallen when Jesus was crucified. All hope was lost. When we pull for what is right, regardless of the probability of outcome, are we in effect living our Christian call? If so, wouldn't it be unchristian to vote for a genocidal candidate during an election? Could a Christian in good conscience have voted for either Kamala or Trump? Well, to answer the last question first, I don't see how a Christian in good conscience could vote for anyone who supported genocide. Jesus' disciples were more than crestfallen. They abandoned him to the mob. They did believe all hope was lost. They denied him, some of them. When we pull for what is right, regardless of the probability of the outcome, that is what it means to bear the cross, and your commitment to divine law, if you want to call it that, which supersedes human law, the laws of principalities. The resurrection in the Christian Bible, for me, there's a more powerful story. It's 3 weeks after Christ was crucified, and the disciples, or several of them, were pulled before the Sanhedrin, which is the court, and there they don't deny their discipleship. But initially, you're right, they did. They were afraid. And, I think that's the kind of power of the crucifixion, because Jesus was, of course, killed as an insurrectionist by Roman authorities. And he defied Roman authority, and it terrified Rome, as perhaps it should. Tim, I'm deeply concerned about the escalation in fascist repression we would see in the aftermath of a potential major terror attack in the U.S. Do you have any ideas of how people of conscience can prepare themselves for such an event? I don't think we have truly reckoned with how much worse it can get. Thanks for your work. Yes, Tim, that is probably my primary concern. Given what we've done in Gaza, given the slaughter that we have aided and abetted, whole families wiped out. And remember, in Gaza, families live together in either in a block, oftentimes because it's one of the most densely packed places on the planet, or even in the same apartment building. Oftentimes when a son or a daughter will get married, they'll simply add another apartment, another story to the building. And so when they're wiped out, you've destroyed an entire generation. So you have, at this point, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who've been completely dispossessed, abandoned. They feel correctly. They've been forgotten by all of the global community, with maybe the exception of Yemen and Hezbollah, maybe. That trauma, that suffering, that anger will eventually lead to, what the CIA call blowback. And if there is another terror, I think it's inevitable that there will be some kind of an attack, a lashing out at these forces, particularly the United States, that have enabled this genocide. And you're right, that's a gift to the Trump administration, and they'll use it in the same way the Nazis used the Reichstag fire to impose martial law, or in the case of Stalin, the assassination of Kirov. That's a big concern of mine. And at that point, then, as bad as things are, things will get much, much worse. Cole Langdon, have you always voted Green, or was there a time when you voted for Democrat? Just curious about your political evolution. I was overseas for 20 years, so I really didn't vote. And when I came back, I spent a lot of time with Ralph Nader. And, I'm greatly indebted to Ralph in the same way that I'm indebted to the theologian James Cone and Cornel West, who, very generously, in the case of Cornel and James, you're talking about, two of the country's foremost intellectuals, scholars on African-American theology and history. And they would give me books and I would read them, and, they would kind of talk to me about them, Baldwin and Litwack and all these other great works that I was not familiar with. The same with Ralph. So Ralph really tutored me in the nature of corporate power and the corporate coup d'etat, which has taken place in the United States. Now, Ralph never thought he was going to win when he ran for president, but he used to be able to work with a liberal wing of the Democratic Party that would push through legislation, much of which he wrote. I think 24 bills were enacted, the Mine Safety Act, OSHA, Clean Water Act, all of which were written by Ralph, but then pushed through that liberal wing of the Democratic Party that was decimated, in particular under Clinton, who Clinton took corporate money to do corporate bidding, and that those liberal figures, Fulbright and others, Fulbright actually had hearings on AIPAC, they're gone. And at that point, Ralph realized there was no mechanism within the Democratic Party for him to carry out the agenda towards protecting consumers and broadening the democracy that he had been dedicated his life to. And he said, at this point, we have to build a third party that puts pressure on the Democratic Party. So if we can pull 5, 10, 15 million votes away from the Democratic Party, that will hopefully scare them enough to begin to respond. That was always Ralph's intent. And that made sense to me. So from 2000, so that's 25 years, I've always voted third party. And of course, worked with Ralph. I was a speechwriter. So, yeah, but I've always come out of the kind of far left, religious left. The Barragans were a huge influence on my father, on myself, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement. Even as a boy, I remember there was an Oklahoma senator, and I'm going to draw a blank on his name. I can picture him. Harris, I think was his name. I've always been, even since a kid, attracted to these radical McGovern. I mean, McGovern, I was too young to vote, but I spent a summer in school. I don't know how old I was, 14 or 16 or something, but I spent a summer volunteering in a McGovern campaign headquarters. Of course, my family supported McGovern. So that was probably the last Democratic candidate that I enthusiastically backed. I think George McGovern, who of course was destroyed with a combined effort of the Republican and the Democratic Party hierarchy, was real in his confrontation with corporate power and the military-industrial complex, the war industry. The last major candidate, Henry Wallace, also, and what they did to McGovern, they also did to Henry Wallace. This is from Jennifer Kuyu Majian. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. With Harvard standing up to unconstitutional demands and even Mossad veterans condemning Netanyahu's war, could we be seeing cracks in global authoritarianism? I think the fact that Harvard stood up is hopeful on the one hand. On the other hand, when you looked at the list of demands that the Trump administration attempted to impose on Harvard, including, I can't remember, putting the divinity school where I graduated from into receivership, they were just so outlandish that I think, and far worse than anything. And I'm sorry, my dog Chad has separation anxiety, so you'll have to deal with the whining. But they were so outlandish that there was just no way that Harvard could accept them. What this will mean in the broad scope of things, I think it is a positive, but we've yet to see a really concerted, unified effort on the part of universities, not just elite universities, but all of these universities, to push back, which is what we need. And I think that my greatest fear, and this was discussed at length in the interview I did with Catherine Franke, the Columbia University law professor, while she's been fired for standing up for the abuse of the protesters on Columbia, but she's a really well-known legal scholar, and it's a really, if I was going to push everyone to watch two interviews, it would be that with Catherine Franke and with Jason Stanley, the scholar of fascism from Yale, who was just announced that he's moving to Canada. Watch those two. I mean, those assessments of where we are, I think, are correct. And of course, their great fear is that the Department of Justice has been handed over this whack job, Pam Blundy, and will not enforce. The courts if there was not a mechanism to enforce the court ruling, such as shipping the Venezuelans to El Salvador, the judge orders the plane to be sent back, they just ignore them. Another judge wants Mahmoud Halil to be brought to New York. He's still sitting in Louisiana. They don't care. So there's no, even with good court rulings, if there's no mechanism by which they can be enforced, then the Trump administration can and is doing absolutely anything that they want to do, including, of course, arresting legal residents who have not committed a crime and eviscerating due process. So while I think that the Harvard is a step in the right direction, I'm not sure it's going to be enough. All right, Dom, it's good. I don't know what we're going to try and quiet our dog down. Okay, Daniel Holstein, what books did Nader point you to at the time? Sheldon Woolen's Democracy Incorporated was a major book. Carl Polanyi's The Great Transformation is a very important book. It's what happens when a society is deregulated. I don't. Ralph's a voracious reader, and so I'm going to forget, but I know those two were very big. The book by his campaign manager, her name's Armato, but she's also a brilliant lawyer, and it's about how she wrote a book about how the two parties conspired to block third parties, all the legal mechanisms they used to prevent the rise of third parties. That was a very important book. Those are three. If I can think of some more later, I'll tell you. I am Colt. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin as a technology and as a means of making governments more transparent? Any thoughts on the coming CBDCs? I've stayed away from Bitcoin. I don't invest in stuff I can't understand. Not that I have much money to invest. I'm not really competent to talk about Bitcoin. Brandon A., any thoughts on how to sway or prevent the fight the oligarchy sheep herding back into the Democratic Party? I don't know. I mean, at this point, if people haven't figured out what this is about by now, I don't really think there's much help for them. The idea that the Democratic Party, which is really at this point a corpse, is somehow going to resurrect itself to confront autocracy and restore our open society is, a species of magical thinking as egregious as that embraced by the Christian right. I think Bernie does it because he doesn't want the full weight of the Democratic machine I don't even think it. I know it because I've talked to him about it. The full weight of the Democratic machine to crush him. But it's very opportunistic, and it's just it's not even treading water. It's getting us nowhere. In the end, of course, mounting candidates is not going to blunt the rise of the Christian fascist state. It's organizing. This is what Shama Sawant has figured out with Workers Strike Back, that we have to build movements that begin to shut down the system. That's the only language they understand. And that's where all of our energy should go. But who we should vote for, and is AOC going to run for president? This is a parlor game, and it gets us nowhere. Damaris Tapia, your thoughts on Trump saying he's open to deporting U.S. citizens? Should we be concerned? Yeah, I think that's the next step, without question. And how do they do it? Well, they set the precedent. So these are all gang members, so they're off to the gulag in El Salvador, where I lived for 5 years covering the war. And next thing you know, it's U.S. citizens who push people in front of subway trains. And then the precedent is set. I think both Frankie and both Jason Stanley, when I interview them, see the next step as the revoking of U.S. passports or censoring of U.S. citizens. And of course, they'll mask it by demonizing the first group of U.S. citizens that they target. But once that precedent is set, we're finished. But I do think that is probably very, very likely. Mr. Natural, how can Trump legally hold federal funding to universities over freedom of speech? Well, because the Congress has abrogated or essentially walked away from their role as the uh, enforcer of how federal monies are spent and how federal policies are enacted. So he rules by decree, like a Roman emperor, through executive orders. It's not legal. It's not even constitutional. But again, as I said about the Justice Department, there's no internal mechanism to stop him. So we already have all of the characteristics of kind of a classic dictatorship, where the whim of the dictator, first there are tariffs, then there aren't tariffs. Whatever wacky idea he has, he can get up and act. Aidan Smith, how can we understand the Bernie AOC oligarchy tour? Does it advance the discourse or lead nowhere? Chilling to see attendees boo Palestine protesters. I've always thought, so I had one personal encounter with Bernie when he and I spoke at the climate march years ago, and Shama was there, and Shama pushed him to run as an independent. And Bernie said, I don't want to end up like Nader, which means I don't want to end up a pariah. I don't want them to destroy my career. That's a career decision. Bernie was campaigning for Clinton in 96 after NAFTA. Bernie certainly understood the betrayal of the working class that the 1994 NAFTA bill imposed on workers, 30 million mass layoffs, which of course led inevitably to Trump. So I think Bernie's commitment to the working class is sincere and real. I think I don't think that, I'm a little more distrustful of AOC. I think she's more of a media phenomena. But I just don't agree with Bernie's tactics. He says he's building a political revolution. And then when the nomination is taken from him, and there's also some nefarious moves that the Democratic National Committee did to deny him the nomination, he tells everyone to vote for Clinton. So I don't know, where can you go with that? I mean, you're not going to build a political movement or a political revolution in an election cycle. And it just seemed to me really counterproductive to the goals that Bernie says he is seeking to attain. I think Bernie recognizes how bad things are. He recognizes the complete moral and perhaps political collapse of the Democratic Party. And so he's, reaching out in the way that he can to fight back. But I think there's a mass of evidence that makes it clear that working within the structures of the Democratic Party is counterproductive. And at this point, again, political parties should not be our focus. Our focus should be union organizing. The one power we have to fight back against the state is the strike, especially the national strike. We just had one in Greece. These are it's why the oligarchic and the class, the billionaire class, has worked so incredibly hard to take away the capacity to strike and to break labor unions, because at that point we're disempowered. So it's not a bad thing to run a third-party candidate, but it doesn't change the equation unless we rebuild militant labor movements that can begin to punish power for their excesses and their crimes. This is from Hysteric Raider. Hypothetical: if the Patriot Act was repealed, would we have halted the rise of Trump, or at least restricted his power? No, because not just the Patriot Act. There are a series of acts and measures, including the wholesale government surveillance, the overturning of the Posse Comitatus Act, which 1878 Posse Comitatus Act prohibited the federal government from using the military as a domestic police force. Obama overturned that in Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. I sued Obama in court over it. We actually won, and then the appellate court denied my standing, which means they didn't. It's a very clear constitutional violation. They didn't rule on what Obama did. They just said I didn't have a right to bring a case. We filed a cert to the Supreme Court. That took a long time. The Supreme Court refused to hear the case. So No, there's a series of measures. Again, executive decrees have been abused by Democratic presidents, including Biden. Uh, the militarization of police, the collapse of the court system, all of these predated Trump. And as Ralph said, we've created a mechanism by which when a dictator comes to power, just with a flick of a switch, they assume control. All of the infrastructure is in place, including ICE, which now functions as Trump's personal, police force or brown shirts. ICE does not have a mandate to arrest and detain and deport legal residents. But and what's happened is a lot of people within DHS, Department of Homeland Security, are now being seconded to ICE, whether they want to be or not. So they're building this, kind of paramilitary secret police force. So you've all seen the videos where the student and the tough student is seized. It's right. I watched it in Pinochet's Chile. It is exactly the way secret police work. They don't identify themselves. They come up in unmarked cars. They're not wearing uniforms. And next thing you know, somebody's disappeared off the street. This was true in El Salvador and lots of other countries that I worked in. And so we're already building an internal mechanism by which these egregious violations can be carried out on a systematic and institutional basis. This is Visi. Intellectuals like Jason Stanley have fled the U.S. in response to Trump's victory. Are they overreacting, or are people like them next? Also, would Canada actually be a safe haven for dissidents, considering it is often beholden to the U.S.? Well, so I like Glenn Greenwald. I've long admired his work, but I saw a clip where he attacked Stanley for leaving, saying that Stanley was in a privileged position, all of which is true. But Stanley didn't say he was leaving because he was persecuted. As a scholar of fascism, he said, I'm leaving because I know what's coming. That's different. And I don't think he's wrong. And as somebody who has throughout my career, many, many years, spoken out forcefully against the apartheid state of Israel and on behalf of the Palestinians, I'm certainly on a list. And I know because I've been stopped at the airport. I was stopped once and held at the Newark airport for 2 hours, even though I have a valid U.S. passport. So, and I watch the emergent developments and see them as exceedingly ominous. So I don't think he's wrong. I haven't packed my bags to go to Canada. My wife's Canadian, so that's an asset. Canada still has a parliamentary democracy. I think the antagonism of the Trump administration to Canada has probably distanced. I know it has distanced the Canadian public and the Canadian government from the whims of Trump. Are you safe anywhere if the empire makes a concerted effort to get you? We've seen with extraordinary rendition, with the persecution of Julian Assange, the long tentacles of empire. If you ask me intellectually, I think Frankie and Stanley are reading it correctly. I think we're headed to a very dark place. I think it could affect me personally. I haven't reached a point where I would leave, but I wonder if that point wouldn't be something that the decision would probably be made for me if I'm stripped of my passport or something. But I think about it and I worry about it. What do you think about the integration of AI in the leadership of corporations? AI CFO concerns me. Well, AI, and this is not. I don't know a lot about AI, but I think what has disturbed those of us who follow intimately what happens on almost a daily basis in Gaza is that AI is selecting many of the targets. So it's not even human. They're not humans picking the targets. And we know from reporting by 972, this very good magazine in Israel, that the AI provides so many targets they can't even keep up with it. So there are many pernicious uses of AI. I know I interviewed these courageous students at MIT who have exposed the collaboration of the robotics or the drone program with the Israeli military. And what they're working on is essentially using AI to create swarms of drones that can communicate with each other when they attack targets. So, um, yeah, I see AI as a pretty dark tool of control in the wrong hands. Human rights for all. Can churches advocate for human rights for all? Sure, they can, but they lose half their congregations, which is why they don't do it. I mean, churches are withering away. They are anemic institutions, the same way the press is. And the tragedy is that when institutions like that uh, feel threatened or contract, they become ever more cautious, which only accelerates their own decline. I think that's true for the institutional church, and I think it's true for the press. Cole Langdon, how do you see the future of workers' strike back and the Green Party, and should the former replace the latter? I like Shama. I mean, I flew out to Seattle to speak at the Workers' Strike Back conference, which is on YouTube somewhere. I think Shama's correct in that any political movement has to be based in labor or come out of labor. That's not the Green Party. I, of course, am good friends with Cornel West and supported his presidential bid and helped facilitate his relationship with the Green Party, then subsequently left. And I think that was a mistake because, not because his critiques of the Green Party were wrong. I'm sure, knowing Cornel, there are probably at least many of them right, but because they had an infrastructure by which they could get him on a ballot. And watching Ralph, it's really, really hard to build that infrastructure. But I do think the future of any opposition movement has to come out of labor, and that is a huge deficit vis-a-vis the Green Party. I mean, I voted Green. I don't in Jersey. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't vote for Cornell. He wasn't on the ballot. I mean, I just vote third party as out of principle. And to register my disdain or disgust with the system, and because of course I won't vote for anybody who supports genocide. I don't care if it's just me. But I don't know that the Green Party, unless it is able to really build ties with labor, is going to be an effective mechanism to blunt what's happening. This is Lilith Werner. What is the likelihood we will have midterms? I think it goes back to the question that someone asked about a terrorist attack. If there is a significant act of domestic terrorism, then I could certainly see that being used as an excuse for all sorts of draconian measures, including canceling midterm elections. There's no question that Trump and the people around Trump want to shut down the democratic system. Are they going to have sort of a meaningless plebiscite like they did in countries I cover? I used to cover Hafez al-Assad's elections in Syria, where he'd win by, I don't know, 98.9% or something. Or do they go the China route where there's no elections at all? My guess is they would have kind of pro forma elections. I mean, even the Nazis, up to a certain point, had elections. I think 36 might have been the last election. I can't remember. But I think that if there is an act of domestic terrorism, then it's not implausible that creating a state of emergency or creating martial law could see elections shut down. Alex, why does Trump respect Mexican President Sheinbaum despite her and clear ideological differences and is cozying to people like Bukele from Salvador? Boy, I can't get inside Trump's head. I don't know. I mean, Sheinbaum stood up to him. I mean, she's got a spine. But usually he doesn't like people who stand up to him. So I don't know. Have you read the book Anarchism and Black Revolution by Lorenzo Comboya Ervin? I have not. Okay, thanks. He'd be a great... Okay, I'll look at it. Greetings from Anderson, Indiana, where I wrote a chapter of Days of Destruction, Days Rolled. How do you stay so calm and sober in such an insane world. Well, spent much of my career in worlds that are far more insane and far more dangerous. And I don't know that I could handle combat anymore, but when in combat, um, you have to be. I would even almost feel my metabolism slow down, because if you make the wrong decision, it can get you killed. You can't panic. You can't react emotionally. You have to make as and oftentimes in a firefight, there's total confusion. You don't understand what's happening around you, but you have to make the best decision you can based on the external phenomena around you, and that requires a certain calmness and a certain concentration, and oftentimes what you feel intuitively that you want to do. I mean, for instance, when you're mortared. So when you're mortared, when you're under a mortar attack, you instinctively you want to run, which is the worst thing you can do is stand up and run, because mortars, when they explode in conal shapes. So if you're lying flat on the ground, I was once caught in a mortar attack in a field, and of course you wanted to run to the woods, but the people who stood up and ran got killed or wounded. Uh, and so it's counterintuitive. If you lie flat, the mortar can actually explode fairly close to you and you're fine, if as long as you're flat on the ground. And I think that those kinds of habits are have been useful. Not that I pretend that I could, do what I used to do. I think everybody has a termination point, and I reached mine in the war in Kosovo. But maybe because of that, and maybe because I've just been in situations that are far, far, far worse than what I'm facing now. I mean, life and death situations where people around me, people I know, are being wounded and killed. um, Hard Doherty. Commentary about BRICS and the possible challenge to the hegemony of the dollar. Considering these countries' diverse systems, how realistic is it that they could pose a challenge, or would it fall apart in a short time? I would watch the interview I did with Richard Wolff, because I asked him that question, and Richard Wolff knows far, far more about this than I do. I mean, it's clear that there is an effort by China, Russia, Iran, uh, and other countries to move away from the dollar, and I think Alfred McCoy, actually, I think he gives a date, 2020, 2030 or something. I can't remember the date. But Rick's answer is that it is a slow kind of retreat from the dollar, which will have a deep effect on the American economy. I mean, the real problem is the debt. We're just, we can't sustain this level of national debt. Trump doesn't want to raise taxes. I mean, officially, tariffs are taxes, but the potential collapse of the American economy, should the dollar no longer be the world's reserve currency, I think is assured. The question is, how will it come? Will it come incrementally? Those are all unknowns, but I did explore those with Rick, and it's probably better to let him answer that question. TR Funny, how many people does it take to have an effective general strike? Not being pessimistic, but I see most Americans being opposed to the idea. Actually, very few. I think the figures are 3 to 5%. Now, 3 to 5%, that's several million people. What are we, 330 million people? I can't remember. But if you can pull that percentage, you really have the capacity to shut the country down. And that's really, I think, where all of our effort should go. At this point, we haven't spoken about the climate crisis. We are running out of time. We may already have run out of time. The Trump administration is rolling back, whatever, marginal reforms or improvements the Biden administration put in place. And you actually don't need that many people. That's what's interesting. Danny, did Canada have any influence on your upbringing in Maine culturally? So I didn't grow up in Maine, but I spent a lot of time in Maine because my mother's family was from Maine. Um, and I actually grew up in rural upstate New York until I got shipped off to boarding school at the age of 10, which no one should ever do to their child. I got a scholarship, and I guess my parents thought was good. But no, culturally, it was these small towns. They were not on the coast. They were, inland up around Lewiston, Norway, Poland, these areas. They're very lower working class. They were very provincial in a sense that they were self-referential. They didn't. They were, I want to say they were hermetically sealed, but these people lived within their own ecosystems, which outside ecosystems, like even Boston or something, just did not in any way affect. Certainly, Canada didn't affect it at all. So no, Canada had no influence. I mean, my relatives held all sorts of political beliefs that I didn't like and prejudices, but I loved them very much, and they struggled. They most of them were vets, including my grandfather, and they kept me honest in the sense that I went as a scholarship to these wealthy boarding schools and saw how these kids, these mediocrities from rich families, were just given chance after chance after chance, and how my relatives in Maine, who and my grandfather was quite bright, quite intelligent. He never finished high school, but he never finished high school because his sister's husband died and he had to work the farm and it killed him. And I just thought, it taught me how unfair these class divisions were, but it also always reminded me of who I was and where I came from. And I think that was, a huge asset. I actually have a picture of my grandfather and my uncle. My grandfather was a master sergeant in the army, and my uncle went into the army in World War. He was actually in the army before the war started, and he fought in the Philippines. But I have this picture of their whole Maine National Guard unit, and they're both in it in uniform. Dimitri Smith, what can modern resistant groups learn from radical Christian movements such as the Berrigans and the Catholic worker movement? I think quite a bit. I think modern resistant movements have to learn that they have to hold fast to moral imperatives and not compromise. We can begin with the genocide, but we can talk about other issues. I think that all of us should have walked out of the Democratic Party in 1994 with the passage of NAFTA. I think that should have been it. Should have been over. And the fact that we've not held fast on our own principles means they've walked all over us. And yes, in the short term, you not only lose, but you get attacked. But in the long term, when you stand for something, unlike the Democratic Party, which has transformed itself into the Republican Party and merged with the establishment wing of the Republican Party, but people remember. I mean, I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. I knew Václav Havel, and people knew he wasn't going to sell him out. They knew he stood for, and had been to prison. I think he spent 4 years in prison. So that was our failing. Our failure was to stand with those people we claim to represent: the working class, the poor, the working poor, those in our prison system, undocumented workers. I mean, that's who we should stand with. And whatever force is arrayed against them, we have to oppose. And we can't sell out our principles for expediency. That was I think, our big mistake. And that's something that Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement or Berrigan never did. And these are, I've got a picture of Daniel Berrigan on my wall. He baptized my youngest daughter. It's Daniel Berrigan holding my daughter. Those people have always informed my life. They informed the life of my father, who admired the Catholic worker movement immensely. He was a Presbyterian minister. I've never deviated from that ever, and I think that they have a lot to teach us. There is an NYC. Oh, this is from Athletically Smart. There is an NYC socialist mayoral candidate, Zoran Mamdani, who is polling second to Cuomo. Can his election provide a spark against the Trump regime? Yeah, I've heard about it. I don't know. let's not get caught up in voting. I mean, I'm not saying don't vote for these people, but that isn't going to bring down Trump or put pressure on the Trump regime. It is militant labor activity. That's the mechanism. Mac Anudo, does ignorance play a large role in the fall of empire? How does one help that issue in an era when people's opinions seem to be so entrenched? Yeah, of course. I mean, you always want to keep your underclass uneducated. That's why slaveholders, I mean, they would execute many times if they found enslaved people who could read, because if they could read, then they potentially would know about the slave insurrection in Haiti, Nat Turner, the abolitionist movement, Frederick Douglass, uh, uh, um, and that was Harriet Tubman. That was something that the masters didn't want. So when I teach in the prison, half of those students come in. They cannot read or write, or they read or write at a very low level, third or fourth grade level, because you don't want them to understand the systems of power that have put them in the position that they're in. It's one of the reasons I teach in the prison. And so the destruction of public education. I mean, public education is one of the cornerstones of a democratic or an open society. And the whole effort to turn public education into vocational schools, Musk's assault, who's he going after? He's going after, teachers who earn $60,000 a year or something. I mean, this is nuts. But it is, again, that effort to, and of course, Trump wants this monstrosity from the World Federation Wrestling to shut down the Department of Education. But it's all about privatizing it, corporatizing it, teaching people enough numerical literacy if they're poor to work in a Walmart or Target. But keeping your underclass uneducated is the hallmark of any tyranny. You want to teach people what to think, not how to think, and that's why there are no liberal arts colleges in dictatorial regimes, because the humanities, which is my own formation, is about teaching you to ask the questions. And as Baldwin said, if you can't ask the questions, you can't find the answers. But in that sense, an education is always subversive because it's challenging assumptions. It's challenging ideologies. It's challenging doctrines of power, making you think and critique them. And in authoritarian regimes, that's why they go after intellectuals. And that's why Israel has gone after the artistic and intellectual class, targeting it and killing it. Um, that enforced ignorance is something that all despotic regimes, that characterizes all despotic regimes. Phanto, how entrenched do you think the CIA is on YouTube? I don't know, probably pretty. I mean, they all work in concert. I mean, DHS, CIA, FBI, they all. I mean, there's a funny, Max produces all the shows and everything, and it's kind of a running joke that every time we get above 252,000 on X or on Twitter, it magically goes back to 252,000. I think they've actually might have been allowed us up to 254, but we get subscriptions and then magically people get erased. So there's always there's all sorts of control, deplatforming, demonetizing, which they will do when I do shows on Gaza. They regularly demonetize it on YouTube, which is how I end up paying the production costs. So I wouldn't say that it's just the CIA. I would say, and we know from the Twitter files that Matt Taibbi did, that they had kind of weekly meetings, that there was an incestuous relationship between Meta, these large Google, Apple, and the internal security state. And they hire, many of the people at these private corporations are hired out of these agencies. So, I mean, they've become seamless. They're almost indistinguishable. This is from Dennis Vargas. Can you please state anything about the current elections in Ecuador and how the country is rescending into fascism? I haven't followed it that closely. Um, of course, I'm friends with Julian Assange, and the United States under Biden made a big uh, investment in making sure that Lenin Moreno took power because he would revoke Julian's Ecuadorian citizenship and refuse him political asylum. I lived in Latin America for 6 years. The United States intervention in internal elections was just assumed and often heavy. I mean, this is what I find so risible about Russian interference in our elections. There may have been, although that's not why we have Trump, but we do this in every country around the world including, using American institutions to destroy the candidacy of Jeremy Corbyn. And the if we find any candidate, Aristide, anywhere in the world, in Haiti or anywhere else, that we find antagonistic to our quote unquote national security, which means our really in essence translates into the ability of our corporations to pillage and run sweatshops, then they're targeted in massive campaigns. Matt Kennard writes about this, and I did an interview with Matt about it, but his book is good. Um, and yeah, even Matt was shocked at the internal interference. I mean, including, I think it was Pompeo who said that, they had to prevent the election of Corbyn because he was a security risk. So even in countries like the UK. And this is Ravelin. Is neoliberal a fancy word for ultra-capitalist? Is this administration really neoliberal, not Republican? It feels like neolib hiding as Republicans. So, yeah, Ralph hates the term. I love Ralph. Ralph hates the term neoliberalism, and he keeps telling me not to use it because he says nobody really understands it. I mean, neoliberalism is just the deregulated market, the belief that the dictates of the market should determine society and how it's run. It's not liberal, of course. And in that sense, it's a misleading term. Ralph, I think, prefers the term corporatism. But yeah, I mean, is it ultra capitalist? That's a good question because I mean, not really, because monopolies are not capitalist. Monopolies essentially, and if we wanted to define capitalism as competitive, monopolies crush the ability of other capitalist enterprise, especially small ones, to compete. And so I'm not sure that it's ultra capitalist. Monopoly capitalism, in a classic definition of capitalism, is not capitalism. This is Chinchilla, would you ever consider hosting a dinner with Chris Hedges in New Jersey with proceeds going to anything you deem worthy? Well, yeah, I would, but I don't like to organize. I don't organize anything. I'll speak at events and go, but given the show and given the writing, I can barely keep up. Also, am working on a book. I'm about to go to Egypt, and I'm working on a book with Joe Sacco, the great cartoonist who did Palestine Footnotes in Gaza, on the genocide. So a lot of my energy is going into that, including trying to resurrect. I did study Arabic, but that was 30 years ago. So I've been doing 6-7 hours a week of Arabic so I can bring it back for the book. Was in Jordan last summer doing intensive Arabic. So yeah, I'm kind of running at full speed. But if somebody wanted to organize it, I mean, I wouldn't stop it. Uh, I don't know. I'd have to think about where the proceeds would go. Probably to my students in the prison. Michael Judd, huge fan of you. Thanks. I've read many of your books, such as Empire Illusion, America: The Farewell Tour. In that context, what chance do you think that we win and this crisis has a good outcome? I mean, I don't know that we're going to win, and I don't know that we're going to have a good outcome. But for our own sanity, dignity, self-respect, and if you want to talk in religious terms, our soul, we must resist. And we can't talk about hope, and we can't talk about winning unless we do resist. So I spent 14 years, and including flying to London on my own money to cover Julian's court hearings. And I was very pessimistic about him getting out, but he did get out. I mean, largely because of mobilization, mass mobilization in his home country of Australia. And so, but it wouldn't have happened if we didn't all work as hard as we could to resist. So, whatever hope we have comes through resistance. Yet at the same time, I think we have to be very hard-headed, or see clearly the forces that are arrayed against us, the staggering income inequality that always gives rise to demagogues like Trump, the mechanisms for state control that they are now using against, I mean, all of these, going after these holders with student visas. None of this has anything to do with anti-Semitism. It's about crushing dissent. And I think that the Zionist groups that back it, it's very short-sighted, because as this totalitarian or authoritarian state is cemented into place, they're going to be identified with it. Well, they should be identified with it because they've enabled it. And this is, I read an article in the New York Times the other day about the universities, and they characterize these encampments as harassing Jewish students. I mean, this just isn't even journalism. You had 100 students arrested at Columbia. Police were called 3 times onto the campus. Students were beaten. People, I'm talking about the protesters, students were sent to the hospital because a chemical agent, probably skunk spray or something, was sprayed in their faces by former Israeli soldiers who were students at Columbia on the steps of Lola. None of that was in the narrative. None of that was there. And the you know the press is really culpable in many ways for what's happening, because they repeated this false narrative of these encampments being anti-Semitic. And I spent significant time in both Columbia and Princeton, and these were not, and I mean, probably 30-40% of the protesters were Jewish, young Jewish students with a conscience, and I would argue standing up for, the core of Judaism, which is it was a theology written by oppressed peoples. I mean, totally cognizant of the rights of the oppressed. And I found it very moving. On Friday night, there would be prayers on the tarp that was laid out on the lawn, and then they would hold Shabbat. I mean, this is the kind of world we want to create. And the way that the press demonized the movement and never even bothered to report, it was just really simple decision not to report, and they're continuing it. They created all of the propaganda and Biden did it as well, but they created all of the propaganda that essentially laid the groundwork for now these deportations and expulsions and denying of federal grants and everything else. The press is completely culpable in that. So we'll do one more here. Okay, hysteric. Why do so many Christians worship money, even though it's one of the 7 deadly sins? Well, because any religion lends itself to the worship of idols, and money is a great idol, as is state power. And at that point, you are worshiping an idol. And when we did theological studies about idols, the interesting thing about idols is they always call for the sacrifice of the other, of the demonized other, but ultimately the idol demands self-sacrifice. This is a kind of brilliant theological insight, which I think is true. I'll do one more question from Lee Martinez. I'm a medical legal death investigator. I was wondering your thoughts on when people die of all cultures, why do they see dead relatives? Is it a coping mechanism of the brain? Huh. Well, I can't answer that because I haven't been there yet. I don't know. I mean, I have heard that, but I don't know. I mean, there's so much we don't understand black holes. I mean, who knows what happens once we're gone? So great. Well, thank you very much for this Q&A. I'm sure Max will prod me to do another one soon. And thanks for, supporting the Substack, because I got nowhere else to go. I've been pushed out of so many institutions, and it's really your support that makes it possible to continue my work. And I really, really, really appreciate it. Thank you.